Okay, well, it looks like our numbers have built up online, and we've got enough of an audience here to make it loud enough for you. So first of all, I'd like to just start with an acknowledgement of country. And this is to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands of which JCU operates. And on this campus, that's our Jabukai, Gimoy, Walubara, Yidinji, and Iriganji people. And to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And the name of our campus is, was initially the Smithfield campus, but it's also been named the Numa Buddha, and that was gifted to us on our 50th anniversary, and it means belonging to tomorrow. So let's welcome Kasey Barton, who's a professor of functional ecology in the School of Life Sciences at the University of Hawaii. Kasey joined the faculty in 2010 following a NERC postdoctoral fellowship at the Royal Holloway, University of London. She obtained her PhD in 2007 from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Kasey's research investigates island plant functional ecology, particularly plant responses to climate stress, drought, and sea level rise, hence the beach work. And invasive plant interaction, seedling recruitment within an evolutionary ecology framework. Fortunate, of course, to be living and working in the Hawaiian Islands, the most remote archipelago in the world. And you're right, one of the most fascinating floras as well. So thank you very much, Kasey.
All right, well, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be able to share with you all some of the research that we've been doing in my lab. I wish I was there talking in person. That would be pretty exciting, but nonetheless, this is a great opportunity. So the work that we do in my lab is really to try to understand how island plants are coping with global change factors. So this does include a lot of climate change dimensions, drought, sea level rise, heat, but it also includes other aspects of global change, so lost habitat, novel interactions with herbivores, and invasive plant competitors. And we do this because we want to try to help inform conservation, but also because there have been lots of ideas about how evolution has occurred on islands to lead to really distinct phenotypes of island plants and also island animals. And so we're trying to investigate questions about whether island plants are fundamentally different from continental plants. So that's really the foundation of what we're doing. And we do this using mostly experimental approaches and trait-based approaches for mechanistic insights. So biologists have been fascinated by islands for centuries. And this is in part because island biodiversity is unique. So if we look at the taxonomy of island biotas, they tend to have biotic disharmony, which means some groups are overrepresented on islands compared to continents, while other groups are underrepresented. And this results from variability among different kinds of organisms in their capacity to disperse across the ocean and colonize islands, and also variability and subsequent diversification. So this leads to biological communities on islands that are fundamentally different from continental biodiversity. And this island taxonomic biodiversity is sort of clear and indisputable, and it's characterized by really high rates of endemicity. So a lot of species that occur on islands are found nowhere else in the world. What's less clear is whether there's also unique island phenotypic biodiversity. So the idea that the phenotypes of island species are fundamentally different from continental species is usually referred to as an island syndrome. In the case of plants, the island plant syndrome. And it's thought that this has evolved convergently across a lot of different plant lineages in response to the abiotic conditions that characterize islands, being surrounded by large bodies of water, very windy conditions, orographic rainfall, relatively few disturbances compared to continents. but it's also thought to have evolved convergently in response to biotic disharmony. So as a consequence of the unique species interactions that occur on islands. Whether or not there's unique island phenotypic biodiversity is still an unanswered question, even though a lot of times we treat these island plant syndrome predictions as if they're already facts. So for island plant syndrome, the phenotype or the traits that we think are associated with island plants emerge from these species interactions that occur in islands. So things like being poorly defended against herbivores because there's a depauperate herbivore community, unique kinds of reproductive strategies in consequence of there being depauperate pollinator communities, low fire tolerance, and also the idea that island plants have converged on a conservative resource use strategy that leads them to have slow growth rates, slow life histories. And this island plant syndrome predictions, these different traits that we think compose the island plant syndrome, are really well presented in this book, Evolution in Isolation by Kasey Burns. This is the topic that interests you. I think this is a really nice book. He does a really good job of presenting the evidence, which usually comes from really charismatic examples for each of these different syndrome predictions. But then he discusses how that's sort of the extent of the evidence. So having a few really good classic examples does not make a syndrome. Instead, a syndrome should be common enough because it has evolved convergently across a lot of different lineages. And that's what we still don't know. So the weight of evidence is still missing for, I would say, almost all of these island plant syndrome predictions, which is why I'm emphasizing them as predictions. Even though often in the literature, I think they're presented really as paradigms. In my lab, we've investigated various of these island syndrome predictions, which I've underlined here on this slide. But for the rest of the talk today, I really want to focus on this prediction that island plants are slow growing and conservative in their resource use. And this idea was actually co-opted from observations that were made about island animals by European explorers. So they were describing island animals as naive, as vulnerable, as lacking sort of awareness of novel predators, things like that. And that same kind of wording and syntax was then applied to island plants, suggesting that island plants are also naive and vulnerable and sort of incapable of competing against continental plants. This idea really gained steam in the last couple of decades because there's widespread evidence that island plants are in decline across a lot of archipelagos, and that this is occurring simultaneously with the establishment and spread of invasive plants, usually from continental, though not always. So this has been described and observed across a lot of archipelagos. And so it's been inferred that the simultaneous decline of the native island plants and the spread of continental plants is evidence that those continental plants are outcompeting the more conservative, slow-growing island plants, and the idea that island plants are thus weak competitors. But the simultaneous occurrence of these two things does not necessarily inform us about the underlying mechanism. There's a lot of other things that happen when non-native plants establish in a novel community. Mutualisms are disrupted, soil processes are disturbed, and on islands, there's a lot of other global change factors occurring at the same time. So I think we need to dig into this a little bit more than just the simultaneous occurrence of these two things telling us what's going on. Here's the logic chain that is usually used to explain this idea that the displacement or the simultaneous spread of invasives and decline of natives is evidence for competition. So if we start at the top here, it's clear that in a lot of archipelagos, islands have low species richness. So they're biodiversity hotspots, not because they have a lot of species, but because those species are often unique because of high endemicity. Nonetheless, having low species richness is usually thought to correspond to having unfilled niches in that community or that landscape. Unfilled niches is usually thought to then imply that there's weak competition among the species that occur in that place because there was a lack of sort of niche differentiation among those species. A lack of competition is thought to have relaxed, fast, or vigorous resource use strategies in these native island plants, leading them to converge on a conservative resource use, leading to sort of slow growth and weak competitive capacity. So then when non-native species from continents are introduced, they quickly fill those unfilled niches. They are easily outgrowing because of their more vigorous resource use. And that is how we end up here with declines in native island plants and the spread of invasive plants. This is the logic chain. There's a lot of assumptions on each of these steps, which I think are in many ways problematic. And we could spend ages just on this slide alone, but we're not going to. I want to keep us moving and highlight that these first two pieces are well established. We know that many islands have low species richness. And we also know for sure that native island plants are in decline. There are high rates of endangerment and high rates of species extinctions. What's missing is the mechanism. We don't know exactly how these two patterns are linked. And actually, if we look carefully at this logic chain, we see that there are two testable predictions that emerge, and they're actually giving us opposite ideas of the role of competition. So the empty niche hypothesis is that there's empty niches on islands that invasives easily occupy. But associated with that would be weak competition with natives. That's the whole idea of an empty niche, is that the invasives establish into that empty niche without having to compete with the natives. So by this reasoning, we would expect no competition to be happening between natives and invasives. But on the other side, we're expecting that the native plants are conservative in their resource use and the invasive plants are vigorously outcompeting them because they have a faster resource use. These are the two ideas that we can test and address. These are testable predictions, even though they are giving us opposite ideas of the role of competition in this change in community composition on islands. This folds very nicely into Darwin's naturalization hypothesis, which is really about invasion everywhere, not just islands, but anywhere. And what Darwin predicted is that phylogenetic relatedness would predict invasion success because related species often have or are assumed to have similar niches. And if they have similar niches, they're likely to compete. And so he reasoned that invasive species would be more successful establishing in communities where they lack close relatives, because that would mean that they don't have the biotic resistance of competing with those relatives via shared niches. So this is a phylogenetic analysis to look at the relatedness between invasives and natives. A lot of people have investigated this, including on islands. And the evidence is really mixed. There's sort of equal number of studies showing that invasives are more closely related to natives than expected by chance, as more distantly related than expected by chance. There is, of course, the opposite idea, Darwin's naturalization conundrum, which is that we might actually expect invasives to establish more easily into communities where they have close relatives, because the presence of those close relatives means that they're likely pre-adapted to the environmental context of that novel habitat. So in this case, we might expect invasives to be more closely related to natives in the places where they successfully established. Well, like I said, there's sort of equal number of studies for and against this idea of relatedness between invasives and natives. More importantly, I think we need to sort of question the use of phylogenetic relatedness to understand competition and shared niche space, because the idea that there's phylogenetic niche conservatism, that closely related species have similar niches and therefore whether or not they're likely to compete, requires that they have not diverged in their phenotypes such that they use different kinds of niches. But the whole idea of island plant syndromes is that continental plants arriving on islands diverge from their continental relatives because they're adapting to that island context, and that the island plants have converged on a phenotype that is fundamentally different from their continental relatives. So I think for islands in particular, using phylogenetic analyses to infer species interactions during invasion is probably very problematic. So let's set that all aside and look for more direct evidence about competitive interactions between native and invasive plants on islands. Usually, the best evidence for competition is to quantify the direct effects of neighboring plants on the growth of individual plants. This requires demographic studies where we monitor the growth over time in the context of neighbor identity and density. These kinds of studies are generally lacking on islands. In Hawaii, we have no long-term demographic studies done at the scale of communities. So we actually lack this kind of direct evidence to weigh in on this important question. Another line of direct evidence could come from experimental work. So it's very common for people to do pairwise or neighbor experiments in which they grow plants together in pots or sometimes in the field, and they measure the effects of the neighbors on the focal plant growth. This is so common that there's been a meta-analysis quantifying how the identity of the neighbor influences the magnitude of competition. And they found that invasive neighbors suppress the growth of native plants significantly more than native plants suppress native plants. So we obtained this data set, which includes 1,241 of these experimental tests. We went through all of those, identified 62 that were conducted with island plants, and we tested whether the magnitude of competitive effect is stronger for island plants than continental plants, which we would expect if those native island plants were weak competitors. We actually did detect a marginally significant effect or difference between competition studies on islands versus continents. But interestingly, this was driven by really intense native-native competition in these pot studies, not native and invasive competition. So actually, this sort of pokes a hole in the original logic chain, suggesting that competitive interactions among native island plants is weak, and indicates that actually the intensity of competition on islands might be even stronger than continental plants. Nonetheless, this isn't good direct evidence for our question because there was actually none of these that compared native invasive competition. So again, we're sort of lacking this kind of evidence. The third way that people infer competition is indirectly through trait analysis. So the idea here is that by characterizing the functional traits of plants that we think are associated with resource use, we can infer both the overlap in resource use, that this is the kind of niche question, but we can also do directional sorts of tests to see if, for example, the invasive plants have a faster, more vigorous resource use than the native plants. So this fits very nicely within the leaf economic spectrum hypothesis, in which there are a suite of traits associated with leaf carbon economics, so return on investment in carbon. And we can predict using this approach that the traits should indicate that the invasive plants have a more acquisitive, faster resource use than the native plants. At least that's our prediction. So that's the approach that we've been taking, this functional trait approach, which is an indirect way of assessing likely competition between native and invasive plants. And we've been doing this here in the Hawaiian Islands, which is a fantastic place to be an evolutionary ecologist and a botanist, because we, as the most remote archipelago, have an incredibly highly endemic flora. More than 90% of the angiosperms are endemic. The 1,500 native species diversified from a mere 259 colonizing plants. And that was very variable across different lineages. So many of those species failed to diversify, and we have some amazing adaptive radiations. We also demonstrate that sort of classic pattern that we're observing in contemporary floras, which is declines in the native species. So we have really high rates of endangerment and unfortunately some extinctions. And we have really high rates of introductions and establishment of invasive species. In our natural areas, there are now equal numbers in terms of richness of native and invasive plants. So to test this question about resource use and to compare the leaf economic spectrum traits of native and invasive species, we've been measuring these functional traits across a diversity of plants to try to get at general patterns, which is what we need to do if we want to address whether these phenotypes are characteristic of a syndrome. So in this study, we've included 87 plant species, which is 55 native and 32 non-native species. We focus most of our sampling on Oahu because that's where we live, but we also sampled plants on Hawaii Island, Maui, and Kauai. So there are many previous studies that have done similar kinds of things, measuring functional traits to try to infer species interactions and specifically competition between native and invasive plants to investigate this same question. Our study is unique in its scope. So most previous studies were really limited in terms of the number of species or the sites where they sampled. We purposely tried to capture a really large gradient in terms of environmental heterogeneity across the landscape and as many species really as we could find. This includes common plants as well as some rare species. And this was a fantastic study that was led by the fabulous Andrea Westerband, who was a postdoc at the time with me. She's now a professor at the University of Louisiana, and she spent 18 months in the field carrying heavy instruments up difficult trails to collect these data in fairly remote sites. And we had 3 fantastic graduate students, Tiffany Lum, Kari Bogner, and Kealoha Feliciano, who were in the field with her. And we had a tremendous team of undergraduate students. So this was really a big team effort because there's a lot of work in the field to collect these data in the sort of narrow windows when we can measure photosynthetic traits, and then a lot of lab processing of samples after the fact. So what a wonderful team of scientists I got to work with on this. These are the traits that we measured. So like I said, we are targeting traits that are associated with resource use and specifically the leaf economic spectrum, because that is thought to contribute to vigorous growth strategies and life histories. So these included metrics associated with gas exchange, so photosynthesis, transpiration, conductance, as well as leaf morphology and chemical traits, nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon-nitrogen ratio. These are the classic leaf economic spectrum traits. Here are the predictions. So on the acquisitive side, we expect invasive plants to have a lower leaf mass per area, but larger leaf area, high rates of photosynthesis, assimilation, conductance, transpiration, high leaf nitrogen, which corresponds to a low carbon nitrogen ratio, high phosphorus content, and low water use efficiency. So a fast return on cheap tissues, that's associated with fast and vigorous growth. And native plants at the other end of the spectrum, sort of the opposite of those, associated with a conservative, long-lasting tissues and slow return on investment. Okay. Usually when people do these kinds of studies, they compare the means of the species at the scale of the archipelago. And we were worried about this because we thought that if the species differed in where they occupied habitats across space or in the landscape, that we could detect trait differences that aren't relevant for species interactions, but are simply because of species sorting in the landscape. And this is likely to be occurring in Hawaii because a lot of the native species are now sort of relegated to high elevation, colder climate habitats. And the invasive species are really abundant and common in low elevations. And this reflects the point at which invasive plants are introduced, mostly by people and at low elevation. And of course, they are moving up in elevation, but they haven't yet reached the really high elevation sites. So we worried if we just sampled native plants where they're most abundant at high elevation and invasive plants where they're most abundant at low elevation, we're clearly going to detect trait differences simply because they're in different kinds of climates, soil substrates, and habitats. So we obviously wanted to avoid that complication. And so we were mindful of selecting sites only where we could sample native and invasive plants simultaneously. So they had to co-occur together. And we identified 45 of these sites across those 4 islands. And we also purposefully positioned these across these really steep gradients because Hawaii is a classic high island. We have really steep and tremendous environmental gradients, which leads to a lot of spatial heterogeneity, which is likely to contribute to resource use strategies and interactions between native and invasive. So we wanted to capture this gradient. It spanned from sea level all the way up to 2,000 meters in elevation, from 400 millimeters mean annual rainfall to very wet sites at 5,600 millimeters, and a temperature gradient of mean annual temperature from 10 to 24 degrees Celsius. So these are pretty tremendous environmental gradients represented by our 45 sites. Now, let's look first at these trait differences at the scale of archipelago. So this is hard to see. I know that. There's a lot of data here. Each of these panels is one of those traits that I showed you. And on the left side for each panel in teal is the invasive plant. And then on the right in gray is the native plants. So at the archipelago scale, for the most part, we're seeing that there are minor differences between natives and invasives for most traits. These are all non-significant. I've circled the traits which we detect to be statistically significantly different between natives and invasives. These 5 here. And they are all in the direction that we predict, that invasives are more acquisitive than the natives. And here's the description. So native plants tended to have smaller leaves that were thicker. They were tougher, so higher leaf mass per area, and they had lower nitrogen content and a higher carbon-nitrogen ratio. So those significant differences are supportive of the prediction that invasives are more acquisitive than natives. This is at the archipelago scale. Let's look zooming in now to the island scale. Here's the island scale. Harder to read. We have different colors for the different islands. Same thing, invasives on the left, natives on the right. Almost none of the differences are significant anymore when we zoom into the island scale. So the significant differences at the archipelago scale is usually the scale that macroecology or island functional biogeography is operating at. But when we zoom in to a more local context, we see that there's a lot of variability and we're losing these significant trait differences. But island scale is also pretty big. The scale at which invasives and natives are actually competing is the local scale. It's the site where we measured the traits. Let's look at that scale. Here we go. Each of these lines connects the invasives and the natives at a particular site. So there's 45 lines for each of the traits. The gray dots and lines are sites where there's not a significant difference between natives and invasives for that trait. And the red lines are the sites where we detect significant trait differences. So what we can see first off is that at most sites, the natives and invasives are not different from each other in terms of their functional traits. So there's no evidence for most of these sites that the invasives are more acquisitive than the natives. Where we do see significant differences, it's often variable. So here we have, this is a case where leaf area, the natives are larger than the invasives, but there are other sites where invasives are larger than natives. So there's a lot more going on when you actually zoom into the local scale, which is the scale that really matters for species interactions. This is the scale we need to be looking at if we want to understand competition. And we see that these trait differences are far from general. Let's look at multivariate trait space, because actually these traits co-vary as part of a leaf economic spectrum. And we can see and detect this covariance using principal component analysis. And in this case, actually, we ran a redundancy analysis, which imposes a constraining axis to test whether invasives and natives separate in multivariate trait space. The invasives are the purple dots and the pink ellipse, which is this over here. And the native are the black dots and the blue circle. Well, they don't separate by very much. So there's a ton of trait overlap in multivariate space. It is significantly different in multivariate space, but you can tell for the most part, these multivariate trait spaces are overlapping. So those differences are not compelling. They probably explain relatively little of biological functional diversity. So when we consider all of this and these variable patterns that we see at the local scale across those 45 sites, it feels to me not that surprising because we purposely sampled really heterogeneous sites. We we tried to capture that variability in climate and soil substrate that we know exists across the Hawaiian Islands. So of course, that translates into variability in resource use by native and invasive plants, and therefore the likelihood that they're competing for resources and that underlies this shift in community composition. So let's see if we can fold climate into this. So for those 45 sites, we obtained a lot of climate data from the Hawaii Climate Data Portal, which includes tons of different climate variables. We put all of these climate variables into a PCA. And what came out, what explained the variability across our 45 sites was basically two axes. One we're calling the moisture axis because it correlates most strongly with soil moisture and humidity, air humidity. And the other axis we're calling the solar energy axis because it correlates most strongly with air temperature and potential evapotranspiration. So if we now analyze our functional traits of native and invasives in combination with climate, can that help us understand this variability across sites that we're detecting at that local scale? And it turns out, yeah, it can. These traits do correlate with these climate axes. And interestingly, the native and invasive plants vary across these climate gradients in distinct ways. So they're not in the same patterns. So here's an example. This is photosynthesis or assimilation rate, and this is that solar energy axis. And the light gray line is the native plant species, and the solid black line are the invasives. And you can see first off, there's a lot of overlap between the natives and invasives. This is what we're observing most of all, is that these two groups of plants do not separate in trait space. Instead, there's a lot of overlap in how they're using resources. But if we look at the extremes of this temperature gradient or the solar energy gradient, we see that in cooler sites, the invasive plants have higher rates of photosynthesis, indicating that they may have a more acquisitive leaf economics strategy. But if we go to the hotter sites, now the natives have higher rates of photosynthesis, suggesting that they're more acquisitive. So the outcome of these traits in terms of climate switch across the gradient. And in this sort of moderate climate range, they converge on a similar photosynthetic rate. So that suggests that whether or not which group of plants is more acquisitive is contingent on climate. And certainly not the case that invasives are generally more acquisitive than natives. I'm just going to summarize what we found across all those traits. And generally, the invasives were more acquisitive in the wetter and the cooler sites. So there was also that water axis relationship. But the natives tended to be more acquisitive than the invasives in the more arid and the hotter sites. And importantly, they converged on similar functional trait strategies in mild climates. So clearly, the species interaction is likely to be varying with respect to climate. If we put this back in the context of those two testable predictions that came from our logic chain, I think we can conclude that the empty niche hypothesis does not seem to be well supported because there's a ton of trait variability and a lot of overlap between natives and invasives. They're not separating in trait space the way we would expect if the invasives were occupying a niche that was left empty by the natives. We can also say that it's not generally the case that invasives are more acquisitive than the natives, leading to a faster, more vigorous resource use and life history strategy. Instead, there is evidence that the natives can be more acquisitive than the invasives in some environments. So I would say casting doubt on this prediction altogether. So what's going on? Because it's clear that invasives are very successful and that native plants are in decline. Well, the underlying mechanism is still unclear, and it's probably multiple simultaneous things happening, right? So resource use competition could be driving this displacement in some habitats. We find evidence of that in a subset of the environments that we tested. But there's lots of other things that could be going on. Lost mutualists, which I've already mentioned, both seed dispersers and pollinators. A reduction in the habitat availability and fragmentation of the habitat. Climate change. There's novel diseases. So there's a lot of things happening. simultaneously with likely non-additivities, casting doubt on competition being the primary driver of this displacement. It's also possible we're measuring the wrong stage. So one of my particular interests is in seedling recruitment, and I still wonder if competition is most important during seedling recruitment. That could mean that by looking at the adult trees in this functional trait study, we've simply missed the stage at which the functional trait differences occur and matter. So this is something we've been thinking a lot about, and actually we've collected the same suite of traits for 43 of these species, so a subset of the total field study, natives and non-natives, to try to get at this question of differences in functional strategy and leaf economics at the seedling stage. So we're still analyzing this data, but I think that might still shed light on this prediction. And then finally, I think invasion dynamics have distracted us from the original question, which was really about island plant syndromes. The problem with focusing on continental plants that are invasive in islands is that invasive plants are a non-random subset of continental plants. So they're probably not very representative of continental plants, which is really what we should be comparing the native island plants to as a test for island plant syndrome predictions. So the reason that people often test island plant syndrome predictions with an on-island comparison of native island plants and continental plants that are established there as invasive species is because we're controlling for site. And we know that site, environment, and climate can contribute to these functional traits. So by controlling for site, we think this might be a robust comparison. But of course, like I said, it may be a good comparison for invasion dynamics, but it's not a good comparison if we want to know whether island plants are fundamentally different from continental plants in general. And that's because the subset of plants that become invasive are also different from most native continental plants. There's extensive evidence for how invasive plants that become invasive are functionally different from non-invasive native continental plants. So we would expect this difference even on continents. What we need to be doing is comparing our native island plants to native continental plants that aren't invasive. That's our best test of island plant syndrome predictions. So to do that, we've collected a slightly different data set. It's our same native species with a couple of additional ones. So now we have 52 native plant species, and we collected non-invasive native continental plant species for the same traits from TRI using various sources to compile this big global data set of 854 continental plants to test whether the native island plants are fundamentally different from these native continental plants, as I think a better test of island plant syndrome predictions. Here are the results for that in multivariate trait space. Again, we see in this case that this PCA axis aligns with the leaf economic spectrum. The gray dots are those continental native plants. The red dots are our native Hawaiian Island plants. And no, there is no detectable difference between our native island plants and these continental plants measured in continental places. So again, just sort of further support for the idea that island plants have not converged on a conservative resource use. They are not clustered down here on this side of this multivariate trait space, but instead they demonstrate the full swath of functional diversity that we see in any flora, which actually isn't that surprising because there's a lot of heterogeneity in the Hawaiian Islands and a lot of different ways for the native plants to have diversified across the landscape. Okay, so I hope I've shown you that Hawaiian plants don't converge on a conservative leaf economic strategy, that trait differences with invasive island plants in Hawaii, but also with native continental plants are weak or absent. And so resource use competition probably doesn't explain the declines in the native plants that we're observing, at least for most species and most sites. Spatial context really matters, as does scale. I think we need to be very mindful of that moving forward. The local scale is more informative for this type of question than the archipelago scale. Still, We only included like 55 native plant species in our study, which felt like a lot, but isn't a lot when we consider there are 1,500 native plant species. So can we scale up from our big field study that tried to sample and capture these big environmental gradients? I don't know. I'm nervous to do that. I think maybe we need more data. So our current efforts are in scaling up away from just these single studies, which have characterized this functional trait approach so far in Hawaii, to a more synthetic approach that allows us to combine data from more species across more sites. So that's our current effort. We're building a new open access database for Hawaiian plant traits. I'm calling it High Traits. This is something that we're actively working on right now. I have a new postdoc, Mani-chan Sachi-chan, right here, who's leading this effort. And what we're doing is using systematic review methods to identify sources of published trait data of plants measured in Hawaii, so native and also non-native plants. We're extracting those data from the studies and compiling it with a bunch of new metadata, especially climate data, to try to synthesize across the whole archipelago. So our only rules are that the data had to be sampled in the field, so we're not including greenhouse trials, and we're being very comprehensive in taking any kind of trait data. So not just leaf economic spectrum data, but reproductive data, performance data, basically anything that is a measurable trait that's being presented at the individual scale we are extracting. And then the key here is that we're doing this in a geospatial context. So we're linking the places where the trait data were measured to the site, because we now know that the site characteristics are really important. So we want to know the climate, the elevation, the substrate, where those data were collected. This is a huge effort. Again, I have a fabulous team of Mani, and then a whole bunch of undergraduates have been involved in this. And this is a grad student, Gabe, who came out in the field with us to fill some data gaps in the beach. You can see here, that's our coastal work. So far what we've done is we've assessed about 2,200 papers. We've extracted data from 221 of those. So far, we have 22,446 data points. Each data point is a measure of one trait of one plant at one site. So each publication can yield a lot of data points depending on how many traits, sites, and species they measured. If we look at the data so far, we can see that there's some really interesting research biases in Hawaiian plant functional ecology. So most of the studies focus on just a single site or single island. So that the vast majority are on the youngest island, Hawaii Island. So about 2/3 of the data come from that one island. The other islands are much less well represented, and there are few studies that include multiple islands like ours did. So clearly, most individual studies are really narrow in scope, which sort of illustrates the value of doing this kind of synthesis to bring together all of these studies of small focus. Most species studied are woody, which actually kind of reflects what our flora is like. There's 193 endemic species represented, 33 indigenous, 146 non-native species in the database, only 7 Polynesian species. So this is an important data gap because the Polynesian plants are culturally important and used a lot in restoration, but we have very little trait data for those species. There's also a massive bias in terms of the species that people are focusing or collecting data for. So Ohia lehua features prominently. 68% of studies include Ohia lehua, and 34% of studies include only Ohia. So this leaves a lot of species relatively undersampled. So we lack data for most of the native Hawaiian plants, even still, even synthesizing across all of these studies. And as we might expect, because this has been found in other big syntheses, most of the time people are collecting easy to measure traits like leaf chemistry and morphology, because these can be sampled easily in the field and then processed in the lab. There's sort of less of the hard to measure traits in the database so far. I'm not going to go into any more detail. We're sort of in the process. We've actually finished, I think, compiling or extracting the data from field studies. We're in the stage now of harmonizing these various data sources to merge them together into our database. And as sort of practice in doing that, we targeted one initial synthesis about litter quality. And so I'm just going to show you one quick result from that as kind of like a more to come. Litter quality trait data is actually really fascinating because it is an extended part of the phenotype of the live foliage. So the same kinds of traits we can measure in litter, the leaf economic spectrum traits of litter, as what we can measure in live foliage, and they are often correlated. So the leaf economic spectrum of litter is like an echo of the leaf economic spectrum of live foliage. So what we could predict then is that invasive plants should have more acquisitive litter than the native plants, based on that initial hypothesis at least. But there's another twist to this, which is that that high quality, fast return on investment, acquisitive litter of invasives is actually also thought to be easier to decompose, faster decomposition rates, which makes those nutrients available in the soil faster, which facilitates vigorous growth of invasives. So there's a positive feedback here between the acquisitive strategy of live foliage, the acquisitive strategy of litter, and how that can facilitate the success of acquisitive strategies. So for that reason, we wanted to focus on leaf litter, and also because nutrient cycling and dynamics in Hawaii are really well studied. So we put together this initial synthesis. It includes 35 native, 42 invasive plant species litter data from 42 publications, the same kind of traits as what I showed you in our field study. And this is what the results are. So there's a few new traits here. There's more chemistry of litter that's commonly measured. And lignin features prominently in litter because it relates to decomposition rate. But nonetheless, we see these carbon-nitrogen ratio, LMA, nitrogen and phosphorus sort of corresponding to this PC1, which is the leaf economic spectrum. So this is the acquisitive side, high nutrient content, low LMA, over to the conservative side. So what we can see is this is neat because it means that the litter trait data has the same kind of trait covariance, so that we could call this the litter economic spectrum. But if we look at the distribution of our species based on origin, we again see that there's a lot of overlap between natives and invasives. So the native are the blue dots, the invasives are the gray dots, and ohia is a circle around a blue dot. We had to include ohia here because of this massive research bias. And you can see most of the native litter data is from this one species. Nonetheless, if we look at whether plant origin explains this variability in trait space, it is statistically significant, but it explains a very low proportion of the trait variance. So this is kind of echoing, again, what we saw in live foliage traits, where there are statistically significant differences, but it's not that biologically meaningful because there's tremendous overlap between natives and invasives. So this is sort of further support for the conclusions we are drawing from the field study, but now looking at litter quality and using systematic review methods. So with that, I just will close by saying that there's a lot of complexity going on as the native plants are declining and the invasive plants are establishing. I don't think it's as simple as competition and resource use strategies. I don't see a lot of evidence in Hawaii to support the island plant syndrome prediction that the native plants have converged on a conservative resource use strategy associated with slow growth, and that there's really still a lot of opportunity to further explore this prediction and other island plant syndrome predictions. I think we've drawn overly heavy conclusions about these predictions without collecting enough data to properly assess them. So thank you so much again for the invitation and the attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Oh, I think Noel's online and he has a question.
Okay.
Yeah. That was a really impressive bit of work there, Kasey. Thank you. Very interesting. It's interesting looking outside the box, and you've obviously thought about factors that had not been brought into previous analysis of this sort of stuff. So that's one of the things we're facing at the moment with locked-in control plots, which don't reflect what happens in other places of the world. And I've been doing a bit of literature review with these locked-in control plots adjacent to planted sites. And one of the things that came out is this counterintuitive idea that there are factors outside plant features that might be problematic. And one of the things that's come out very strongly is things like allelopaths. I was wondering if you had any studies of allelopathic effects of native or invasive species, whether they be grasses or shrubs or trees.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Allelopathy is one of these other mechanisms that I think is likely to be playing a role. We have evidence for allelopathy involving a couple of invasive plants, like ironwood especially. But there hasn't been any kind of systematic investigation into it, sort of testing across a lot of species. And I think that that is really what I'm trying to argue for the most. We have a few case studies, but that does not allow us to assess or generalize about major drivers without more work. So I think allelopathy is definitely playing a role, but it's unclear how widespread that role is.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, do we have any questions here in Cairns? No? Online? Any more questions online? Okay, Kasey, I'll ask you a question. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and I've had a few ideas about things. I was wondering, so one of the things we're seeing when we're studying forest recovery here is actually how important some of the seed predators are, when you said you were interested in working on seedlings, that is actually one of the areas where we're really noticing how things that we're not studying at all when we were studying plant traits, actually it was herbivores coming in and really selecting specific species. And so we're sort of thinking, oh, look at these dominant pioneers, it must be due to these wonderful leaf traits or functional traits that they have. But actually they just didn't, the other potential pioneers didn't survive herbivory at that very early seedling stage. So what sort of herbivores would you have there that could be selecting for, unprotected seedlings?
Yeah, so we similarly have a big problem with non-native herbivores targeting seeds and seedlings, especially slugs, snails, and rats. So there are massive efforts into controlling those to try to boost native plant recruitment. From our native herbivore assemblage, historically, there were some land crabs that came all the way up into the mountains that were surely seedling herbivores. So those were probably the primary ones, those and geese.
Geese. And that was a very nice presentation, and you've challenged a lot of my preconceptions. And I'm still thinking a bit about that. So I just wanted to confirm, you said that up in the mountains, your wet, cooler sites, the plant species were more acquisitive? They were less, your native species?
No, in the cooler, wetter sites, the invasives are more acquisitive. It's in the hot, arid sites that the natives are more acquisitive.
Okay. And so normally you'd have such different flora from the hotter, arid sites where you have things that are much more adapted to that. And then up in the cooler sites, you would be a more closed rainforest flora. And
Yeah.
so, yeah.
That's only partly true here. We have a sort of common suite of plants that are widespread that occur across really heterogeneous climates. So we do actually see a lot of the same species that we could sample across these really extreme climate gradients. But then, of course, there are also other species that are constrained to certain places. So it's a combination of species turnover and population differentiation driving these patterns.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And that was a lovely presentation, Kasey. So if everyone could thank me again. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll look forward to seeing more work from Hawaii.
All right, thank you so much.